This week on ANN, Adventist leaders interview Mel Gibson, the director of Hacksaw Ridge, a film based on the true story of a Seventh-day Adventist war hero from World War II.
The Myanmar studio of Adventist World Radio is destroyed by a fire caused by a gas explosion.
And the Seventh-day Adventist publishing house in Serbia is recognized by the largest literary event in the region.
These stories and more coming up.
This is ANN, a service of the Seventh-day Adventist World Church.
Thanks so much for joining us this week.
First in the news, moviegoers in the United States, Australia, and Canada currently have the opportunity to learn about the inspiring story of Desmond Doss through the film Hacksaw Ridge. During the opening weekend of the film, which is based on the true story of Doss's heroic act during the Second World War, leaders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in North America had the chance to interview the film's director, Mel Gibson, and screenwriter, Robert Schenken. Doss faced numerous obstacles as he remained true to his convictions of honoring the seventh-day Sabbath and not touching a gun. He would go on to save 75 men under enemy fire. The Seventh-day Adventist Church in North America sent this report.
We are here with Robert Schenken, screenwriter for Hacksaw Ridge. And first of all, I'd like to ask you, what drew you to tell Desmond's story, to write Hacksaw Ridge?
Well, it's such an astounding journey of one man trying to reconcile his faith, his spiritual life, with his patriotism, with his civic duties and responsibilities. And it's a story of a man of principle who refuses to compromise his principles and makes an extraordinary act of self-sacrifice and heroism. I think that's a really important story to be telling today. So often, violence, which is a staple of American cinema, is honored. Typically in the first act, the man of principle refuses to engage. In the second act, his family has been ravaged. And in the third act, he picks up the gun and delivers a kind of justice and becomes a man. Desmond never picks up the gun. And I think that's a really important idea to honor today.
We're with Mel Gibson, director of Hacksaw Ridge. Mel, what attracted you to this story, to tell this story?
Well, it's just a great, compelling story about a man whose courage and convictions and faith, allowed him to do stuff beyond his own power. And I thought that was really compelling and inspiring. So I think everyone should share that story.
So you're telling the story of World War II vets, Desmond Doss, an icon in the Seventh-day Adventist Church and Medal of Honor winners. Did you feel a certain weight or responsibility as you worked on this?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I know Desmond didn't want this story told. People tried to, get the story out of him back in 1948, and then they, Hal Wallace and then Audie Murphy, they sent him to twist his arm, and he wouldn't let go of it. He just wanted to stay in his tool shed, grow vegetables, and pray,
Right.
And it was a very humble guy. He wasn't looking to stand on a soapbox and skite about his achievements.
Right.
He didn't credit himself with those achievements. He credited them to his higher power, to his God. He's like, I agree too. I mean, how could you do that? How could you? Physically, how could you do what he did?
Right.
That's a lot of people to get off top of a ridge in like 8-10 hours, something. It's crazy.
What did this mean to you personally? What did you draw from this experience personally?
Well, you can't live this long with the story of Desmond Doss and not be inspired at some level to want to be a better man.
How relevant is Desmond's story today? Because I know there's a part in the movie where he says, in a time when things are so terrible and bad, is it so bad to try to do put a little good back into it? How relevant is it today?
Oh, I couldn't be more relevant. Couldn't be more relevant. I mean, here we are in a world that still sadly is riven with conflict, and oftentimes, tragically, that conflict is motivated by religious differences. Here's a man who goes to war out of patriotism, but an intense religious belief which he is unwilling to compromise. That's important. Desmond models a very different kind of masculinity than what we're used to hearing in this country, and I think that's really important. So for all those reasons, I think it couldn't be more pertinent than it is right now.
And one last question. How much did you rely on resources like Terry Benedict's documentary, The Conscientious Objector, or The Unlikeliest Hero, the book?
Well, Terry's documentary was the founding document, and his work with Desmond, the interviews and the tape recordings of those interviews, were really the heart of what I had to work with. So I had been badly crippled without it. So I'm very grateful for the work he did. It was inspiring and utterly essential.
Well, thank you so much
you.
and on behalf of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, thank you for honoring the veterans and Desmond in his story.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that.
A fire that took place inside the headquarters of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Myanmar completely destroyed the Adventist World Radio studio for the nation that it's located within the complex. The fire, which was caused by a gas explosion, took place on Sunday, November 6, while an employee was in the office. Sa Ka Pa Mu was immediately hospitalized for a head injury and burns to his hands. Thankfully, he has been released from the hospital and is currently resting at home. The swift efforts of the local fire department contained the fire, which would have destroyed the entire building. Leaders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Myanmar and Adventist World Radio are soliciting prayers as they face the fire's damage.
In Serbia, the Adventist-owned publishing house was recently awarded by the most notable literary event in the region, when a panel of judges at the 61st Belgrade International Book Fair examined books that have made a remarkable contribution to the field of science. The Adventist publishing house, Preparad, was given a special distinction for its book, Mihajlo Pupin, the biggest Christian among scientists. The Belgrade International Book Fair is the most visited cultural event in Serbia. Every year, the fair draws approximately 150,000 visitors from authors, librarians, booksellers, and publishers. In response, Preparad's director, Dragan Pajovsky, said, quote, "In a very strong competition among hundreds of publishers, our release was recognized since the great scientist Mihajlo Pupin clearly underlines that without spirituality and faith in God, there is no true science." He went on to say, quote, "This award has helped make people recognize the uniqueness of our literature and to turn to the quality books that we offer," end quote. Preparad attributes its recent growth in sales to its annual participation in the fair.
Church and education leaders in eastern Nigeria are celebrating the recent approval of an Adventist university in the region. According to Nigeria's premium Times newspaper, Clifford University was granted a license along with 7 other universities during a November 2 meeting of the government's Federal Executive Council. The Adventist Church in eastern Nigeria has petitioned to have the university officially recognized and approved by the government since 2013. Clifford University, which is the second Seventh-day Adventist university in the country, is named after Jesse Clifford, who was the first missionary to bring the Advent message to region in 1923. The university is situated on land in the town of Aihi that belonged to an Adventist school until it was seized by the government after the country's civil war from 1967 to 1970. The church regained ownership of the land in 2013.
In partnership with local law enforcement authorities and government officials, a Seventh-day Adventist church in one of London's boroughs recently launched an initiative to address gang violence and knife-related crimes in its community. The Tottenham West Green Road Seventh-day Adventist Church invited representatives from the city's ambulance service, police department, and political offices to educate members and empower them to be a positive influence. According to the United Kingdom's Multiple Deprivation Index, which measures levels of disenfranchisement, Tottenham is located in a borough that is one of the 4 most deprived authorities in the UK. The area has low income levels, inadequate housing, and high rates of crime. The MP, or Member of Parliament for Tottenham, David Lammy, spoke on why the church needs to be active in the cause. Lammy said, quote, "We can only beat knife crime by coming together to tackle insidious and violent crimes which have taken over certain estates in the Tottenham area," end quote. After hearing presentations from the local officials, the church's pastor, Jude Jeanville, expressed the church's commitment to assist the citywide campaign.
Residents throughout the island nation of St. Croix had the opportunity to assess the status of their mental health thanks to the effort of 2 local Seventh-day Adventist churches. In partnership with nursing students from the University of the Virgin Islands, teams from the Central and Hope Adventist Church organized various stations within the Central Church to help the community members learn more about mental health. The stations provided health assessments, food samples, nutritional information for adults and children, massages, and stress management strategies. The Mental Health Expo also offered counseling for those who have been diagnosed with mental illnesses. According to leaders, the expo was the first of its kind for the Adventist Church in the island. The expo was organized to help meet the needs of more than 18,000 residents of the Virgin Islands who experience a mental health disorder but lack access to affordable health care. The pastor of the 2 churches, J. Wilmot James, said, quote, "The basic function of the church is to be involved in every fact of the life of the community." He went on to say the church should live up to its, quote, "true billing in meeting the needs of the people. Both the mentally afflicted and the poor should be able to receive assistance," end quote. According to the leaders, the 2 churches will continue to organize more mental health expos in the future.
In response to a recent spike of gun violence that has led to unrest and several killings in Kingston, Jamaica, Seventh-day Adventists in the region decided to make a stand for peace. Leaders and members from Eastern Jamaica invited local officials and police officers to their peace march through Tivoli Gardens and Denham Town, 2 of the most troubled communities in Kingston. The march was part of the church's Week of Generosity and Day of Kindness, which took place October 8 through 15. Members performed various acts of kindness and offered prayer to community members. Local police were happy to join the church's efforts in promoting peace. Assistant Commissioner of Police Asan Thompson said, quote, "This is a call we could not refuse. They asked us to partner with them, and we are giving ourselves to you and to the church today, and we feel happy to be a part of this day of kindness." He went on to say, "When they leave, let it be a reference point going forward so persons can say from the day the church came, our place is in good standing."
As Pakistani residents in Jang Sadar villages are still recovering from severe flooding that occurred in August, Adventist humanitarians have remained on the ground to assist those in urgent need. Numerous families lost nearly everything as a result from homes, livestock, and crops. In response, workers from the Adventist Development and Relief Agency in Pakistan have recently distributed food and hygiene kits to help assist 300 families. More than 365 patients were also seen by a medical camp that was organized by the agency.
Coming up, Adventists in France distribute hundreds of meals to refugees living on the streets of Paris.
But up next, a military chaplain unpacks the incredible faith of Desmond Doss.
May I work in with you, young fella?
Yeah. Go for it.
That's the way you do it. Gotta put a little weight on it. Well, I'll put it back up here for you.
Welcome back.
And now, we have more news from our global church community.
Before the November 4 release of Hacksaw Ridge, the editor-in-chief of the Adventist Review and Adventist World magazine, Bill Knott, discussed the faith of Desmond Doss and how it can be applied today with military chaplain Colonel Jonathan McGraw. ARTV has more.
I find myself wondering, Jonathan, at a place like this, why something as tragic and painful as war is so frequently memorialized by beauty, by water, by light, by symbols that seem so far away. Does it ever strike you as an irony?
Well, it does, and I think what soldiers who serve seek is the peace that you see in these kind of environments. Soldiers and service members see the war as a necessary evil, but they seek the peace.
For you, as you think about the figure that pretty much the whole world is thinking about this coming weekend with the release of Hacksaw Ridge, what are the qualities in Doss's life that you as a chaplain see worth us focusing on?
Well, as chaplains, we work in a secular setting. Part of what I see in society is this real fragmentation of human beings. That, what you're at work and what you do in your private life is separate. And so human beings are more fragmented in our society today. And what Desmond Doss does is shows this wholeness.
Okay.
This wholeness, his body, mind, his heart, and his spirit is one. And I think it just gives us all a great opportunity to have a God talk with people. What's the difference God makes in your life?
As the stories unfold about how Doss's comrades looked to him, maybe some of them thought of him like a good luck charm. Others genuinely seemed to respect his faith and didn't want to be in conflict if he wasn't there, because they saw him as somehow a spiritual force in the moment.
And I do think that you could say there was a supernatural sense of what occurred, because if you look at what happened at Okinawa, his company of 130 people, only 30 of them were pushed off, 100 were left up on top. And he stayed there, and as they depicted in the movie, and we've seen it in his documentaries, he just asked, Lord, give me one more.
A living reminder, some would call it, of how we might expect Jesus to act in that situation.
Yes.
That, yes, the unconcern about himself, the concern for other people who are in difficult, desperate moments. Doss has a certain ability to resist the pressures around him to conform to what everyone else is doing, even when it comes to his own safety. Talk to me for a moment about that value as an Adventist value. Our view of where we are in history has often underlined the importance of being distinctive, differentiating ourselves from the culture. Doss seemed to do that in a remarkable way.
He did it while he stayed in the culture. I think part of what we miss is he was as good a soldier as anyone else. The skills you needed on the battlefield, he understood, and that's how he operated. But what I see with Doss is our focus of creation, that God created us in the image of God. And as Adventists, we take that serious in many ways. I recently heard a sermon on Matthew 14 about Peter walking on the water when Christ called him, and Christ asked Peter, why did you doubt me, when he began to sink? He trusted the power of the waves over the power of Christ, and he began. And I think with Doss, we find a human being that what he did on that ridge, he totally trusted Christ's power.
I see something there that the heroes and the saints through history, they have somehow already achieved a sense of peace about their own circumstances, and thus act with what looks like fearlessness to the rest of us.
That is right. Whether they survive or not, there's this sense of selflessness, but also I think with Desmond, when you look at the pull 75 to 100 people off the battlefield, there was this clear sense that he had no doubt that God would use him.
Recognizing that there's somebody out there, wounded, hurting, who's really in need of help at a moment we don't even know who they are just yet.
That's right.
And this is Doss's commitment, not just to buddies, but to anyone who's out there who's lost.
That's right.
With the closing of the Calais refugee camp in northern France, more than 1,000 refugees have relocated to Paris, adding to the growing group of migrants who are living homeless on the streets of the nation capital. There are now approximately 2,500 refugees living in tents throughout the city. With the growing population of refugees comes an increased need for humanitarian care. In response, the Adventist Development and Relief Agency has distributed up to 1,000 meals a day to feed those who are living on the streets.
leaders in the Seventh-day Adventist Church's Indian Ocean Territory recently organized 2 new administrative offices within the nation of Madagascar. During an annual business meeting of the region, the North Madagascar and South Madagascar conferences were officially established. The creation of the conferences has been in the works for several years, but the church in the region encountered various obstacles along the way, including financial setbacks. In a special ceremony, the leaders for the 2 conferences were appointed to commence their ministries throughout Madagascar. Before becoming a conference, the North Madagascar Mission was organized in 2003. It now has more than 27,000 members who congregate in nearly 400 churches and companies under the leadership of 27 pastors. And before the South Madagascar Conference was formed, the South Madagascar Mission was established in 1949. Today, it has more than 22,000 members who congregate in 152 churches and 202 companies, which are cared for by about 55 pastors.
It's been more than 7 months since the nation of Ecuador was rocked by a 7.8 magnitude earthquake that killed 673 people, injured more than 27,000, and caused widespread destruction in the northwestern region of the country. Since then, the Adventist Development and Relief Agency in Ecuador has partnered with local government agencies to meet the housing needs of some of the thousands of displaced residents in the nation. So far, ADRA Ecuador has already constructed enough temporary homes to accommodate 110 families.
An annual event for the deaf at an Adventist campground in New South Wales, Australia, provided the often isolated members of the deaf community the opportunity to fellowship with those who are passionate about meeting their spiritual needs. Record in Focus has more.
Those attending the annual Deaf Camp, this year held at the Adventist Alpine Village Jindabyne, enjoyed a lift from their world of quiet isolation that comes with fellowshipping with their deaf peers, according to Lee Dunstan, who cares for the church's special needs service to the deaf. Says Mr. Dunstan, along with the joy that comes from getting up close to nature, was the spiritual rise the group got from guest speaker Esther Doss from the USA. Esther is a coder, child of deaf adults, so was well received by the group that consisted of hard of hearing, deaf, blind deaf, and their companions. Esther's empathy, which comes from her life lived amidst the deaf, gives her a unique connection. Many of our church's deaf live isolated lives, geographically, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. So they had the opportunity to refill all their empty tanks.
And finally, in the news this week, dozens of school-aged children in need in the Dominican Republic received free backpacks full of supplies thanks to an initiative by the Adventist Development and Relief Agency in the nation. The outreach on October 22nd was in coordination with the Hispanic Association for Citizenship Development in the Dominican Republic. The distribution, however, was part of an ongoing national campaign from the Adventist Church to share hope in cities and communities that are affected by escalating violence on the island and around the world. In addition to giving away free backpacks, members also gave music and drama performances on Bible prophecy and distributed magazines at the Juan Pablo Duarte Park in the city of Asua. During the day of outreach, the president of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in the Dominican Republic said, quote, "You see the wars affecting us daily and how the condition of the world is deteriorating. You can find the greatest hope in Christ Jesus, who can bring peace and justice and help you in all the problems we have every day." End quote. The Seventh-day Adventist Church in the Dominican Republic has more than 286,000 members worshiping in nearly 1,300 churches and congregations.
Coming up next, find out what happened this week in Adventist history.
My daughter was sick and she had to go to the hospital. And I was still working outside of the home. So my job, they didn't trust me. They felt that I wanted to stay home so bad with my kids that I would lie or I would, cheat their time in order to be home with my children. And when people don't trust you like that at a job, that just makes you feel like, why should I even be here? So again, I prayed and I asked God to just please help me out of this situation. Please, I know you know the answer. I don't know what else I could do.
And finally, for today's program, let's turn to David Trim for a look at Adventist history.
This week, learn about the first Seventh-day Adventist church for African Americans that was established in 1886, a time of racial bigotry in the United States.
During this week, 132 years ago and beyond, from November 8 through 20, 1883, the 22nd General Conference session was held in Battle Creek, Michigan, attended by 65 delegates. George I. Butler was re-elected president, but Uriah Smith replaced Andrew B. Oyen as General Conference Secretary. This was Smith's fourth spell as General Conference Secretary and was his 17th one-year term. He was to serve another 4 terms in all. But the 1883 session was also notable because the General Conference Executive Committee membership was enlarged from 3 to 5. It was a first step towards ensuring that, as Ellen White encouraged, power in the church was not concentrated in just a few hands. Today, the Executive Committee has some 300 members from all around the world. On November 9, 1886, a company of 10 meeting in Edgefield Junction, near Nashville, Tennessee, was organized into a church, the first Seventh-day Adventist church composed entirely of African Americans. At this time, racial bigotry in the South of the United States meant that blacks could not worship with whites, and so they formed their own local churches. Among the charter members were John F. Allison and his family, his 2 sons Thomas H. and Jonathan W. Allison, who later were both ordained as ministers and became leaders of Adventist work among African Americans. And 15 years later, in 1901, the first black Seventh-day Adventist camp meeting was held, also at Edgefield Junction. That was this week in Seventh-day Adventist history.
Thanks for watching ANN. Join us next week for more news from the headquarters of the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
In the meantime, join our global conversation on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can connect with Adventists worldwide through more stories, photos, and videos. Visit Facebook/Adventist News, Twitter @Adventist Church, and Instagram @Adventist Church.
Our good news for this week comes from the book of Psalms, chapter 37, verses 23 and 24. The passage says, "The Lord directs the steps of the godly. He delights in every detail of their lives. Though they stumble, they will never fall, for the Lord holds them by the hand."
That's our program for this week. And remember, you can always visit news.adventist.org for daily news and videos. Until next time, God bless.
Take care.